Hi everyone. In our last class, we looked at Native American traditions in southeastern forests and then at early British colonists up until around the time of the American Revolution. And we'll be picking up today where we left off. So let's start by talking just a little bit about Daniel Boone. App State University is located in the town of Boone, so we should all know at least a little bit about who he was. Boone lived from 1734 to 1820, and he's very much part of the environmental history of this period. He fought in the American Revolution, but that's not what he's the best known for. He's mostly famous as a frontiersman, or what was often called a backwoodsman. So he was able to go out in the forest and live by himself, survive for long periods of time. He was an expert hunter. He knew how to trap animals and gather food. Very rugged, very able to make it on his own. And the thing that he's best known for is opening up areas further to the west for white settlement, so helping settlers to get beyond what had been the bounds of white settlement before. And here's a famous picture of Boone leading the white settlers into a new area. He's especially famous for opening up the settlement of Kentucky. Now, for many people, someone like Daniel Boone has counted as a kind of a folk hero, but as historians, we grapple with the fact that this legacy of settlement and wars against Native Americans that Daniel Boone participated in fighting in ultimately led to devastating consequences for Native American populations. In addition to the new pressures that the colonists were placing on the environment, as Native Americans started to enter into new forms of trade for things like guns that they hadn't used before, the natives also started hunting more and taking more from the environment in order to have things like deer skins to trade with the new colonists. And whereas the natives before had tended to take only what they really needed for their own survival from the environment, now they were taking more than they had before. By the time we get to the early 19th century, we get to what's called the Trail of Tears, which is when the federal and state governments forced most Native peoples out of the Southeast almost completely and resettled them in general west of the Mississippi, for example, in Oklahoma, where their descendants often still live today. And as you've probably studied in your history classes before, this was an absolutely tragic event. Thousands of Native individuals died along the Trail of Tears from disease and starvation. And just to give a preview of something we'll get to later in the unit, we're going to look at Elizabeth Rush's pages on the Ile de Jean Charles, which is an island off the southern coast of Louisiana, where some of the descendants of these Native peoples ended up getting to as they sort of peeled off from the Trail of Tears. And we'll look at things that their descendants are facing today in terms of things that are happening with the land in Louisiana on account of sea level rise. So as the colonists pushed across the continent, they had an impact on Native peoples and also an impact on the forests themselves, specifically through the growth of the lumber industry. So the logging industry on a commercial level had begun in the northeastern corner of the country, states like Maine and New Hampshire, spread down through New York, which became the #1 producer in the 1830s. Then in the middle of the 19th century, the industry moved into the Midwest, where the Great Lakes states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota had lots of resources in their forests. Meanwhile, technologies advanced, which made logging and producing wood products more efficient, which was not good news for the forests, which were being harvested more and more and not particularly sustainably. By the time you get to the 1850s to the 1890s, the Great Lakes area has become the nation's greatest wood producer. Now, we've got several students in this class studying finance and business. So this is a really big businessman of this time period, Frederick Weyerhaeuser. He had immigrated from Germany in the 1850s and set up a sawmill in Illinois. Now, this was a time, like I said, when the logging industry was growing really quickly, but it was facing certain problems that had to do with the different people in the industry just not being too well coordinated with each other. So, for example, when people would put logs on rivers to float logs down the rivers to where they needed to go. Lots of different people would be throwing their wood into the same river at the same time. The wood would get all mixed up with each other. It would get jammed and clogged and not get where it needed to go very efficiently. And Weyerhaeuser basically stepped in and helped to unify the industry by getting different mill owners to work together better. And in doing so, he also made himself extremely wealthy. His business ended up being worth something like $70 million, which is a huge amount for that time. The idea of sustainable forestry, sustainable forest management had not come to the United States yet. So at this point, someone like him is basically cutting down trees in a certain place and then leaving that place behind, moving on and logging a new place. And this was done on a huge scale, annual average of about 1 billion feet of logs sent down the river to mills. So that's a lot of wood and a lot of trees. One of my favorite American historians of this time period has a good quotation where he likens Weyerhaeuser in lumber to Rockefeller and Carnegie. So I'll read this quotation for you. Mill owners now controlled every step of the lumbering process, from tree felling straight through to distribution. This was the same sort of vertical integration that was happening in major industries across the nation. Weyerhaeuser had helped accomplish the same feat as John D. Rockefeller in the oil industry or Andrew Carnegie with steel. And the issue of fire always comes up over and over again when we're talking about forests. Sometimes as the logging industry moved quickly from one area to another, they would do things like leave a lot of debris behind. They could easily start forest fires. And the worst of these fires from this period was called the Peshtigo Fire. Happened in 1871 in a Wisconsin lumber town, killed over 1,000 people. For those of you who know the Great Chicago Fire, which burned down basically the whole city of Chicago, interestingly, these two fires happened on the same day. Nobody knows for sure if there was any connection between them, but it's just kind of a strange fact to make a note of. And Peshtigo was the deadliest forest blaze in the history of the nation, if not the world. So this was a very big fire. Okay, at the same time, new consumer products start to use wood more than they had before. Earlier in the 19th century, paper, for example, had been produced from cloth and not from wood pulp. But in the later 19th century, new technologies start to produce paper from wood. So for example, this makes it much easier to produce lots of newspapers. You see a man here reading what's now a very old-fashioned newspaper, a paper newspaper. And things like the rise of newspapers put additional strain on forest resources. Another big strain on forests was the advent of the railroad. 19th century trains, which were at this point expanding across the continent quickly, used wood for various things that trains don't use wood for necessarily anymore. Wood was used for big bridges, wood was used to build railroad cars, wood was used for cross ties. Wood was also used as the energy source to power the trains, so the wood-burning steam engines, for example, would spew out sparks and cinders as they burned, and these would sometimes start forest fires along the train's route. We'll look in a moment at Henry David Thoreau, an early conservationist. Thoreau hated railroads for the various harms that they were causing to the environment. Here's a famous quote from Thoreau about the train. That devilish iron horse, whose ear-rending neigh is heard throughout the town, has muddied the boiling spring with his foot, and he it is that has browsed off all the woods on Walden Shore. And finally, obviously, as trains move into new places, they make it much easier for people to settle the new places, and settlement means houses, buildings, more uses for wood. So compared to the Northeast and the Midwest, commercial logging came to the Southeast a little bit later. What were the reasons for this? First of all, in the warmer southern climate, less wood was needed for heating. Secondly, in the South, most rivers flowed southwards, so if you wanted to transport your logs to northern markets, the rivers were flowing in the wrong direction. Then before the Civil War, the dominant industry in the Southeast was cotton and not timber. After the Civil War, there was an economic collapse. Then the tree that would come to be the most harvested here, the longleaf pine, initially wasn't deemed to be so valuable as a lumber wood compared to the the eastern white pine that was the main lumber crop in northern states. So just a reminder of what these longleaf pine forests look like, the very open forest understory that's maintained by fire. And here's what the longleaf pine looks like when it's very young, just a little baby growing in the foreground here. So basically, the southeastern timber industry started to develop in earnest a couple of decades after the Civil War. And what happened was that Southern politicians started to sell off forest lands to investors from the north. And these northern investors started to develop the southeastern timber industry. People finally came to appreciate that longleaf pine was a great wood. And by the early 20th century, the Southeast was leading the nation in timber production. Again, we haven't quite gotten to the era of sustainable forest management, and so unsustainable practices in this time led to widespread deforestation and the destruction of a lot of longleaf pine habitat that had been one of the predominant ecosystems in the Southeast. And incidentally, for those of you who are interested in modern restoration projects, there's a lot going on today with restoration of longleaf pine forests to kind of undo this long legacy of destroying them through logging. Okay, now just a quick word on the Pacific Northwest. We're going to come back to the Northwest later on in Unit 2, but just so you know, after the Southeast, this becomes the next sort of headquarters of logging in the United States. So there are huge forests in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. Had not been logged heavily in the 19th century, but at the very end of the 19th century, early 20th century, more white settlers are coming out there. Railroads are making it out to the West Coast, and so the logging industry starts buying up more and more land out there around 1900. By the 1920s, the Pacific Northwest has replaced the southeastern states as the national leader in timber production. Okay, and just a glance at a couple species that are important for logging in the Pacific Northwest. Here's the Douglas fir, which is the main commercial tree west of the Cascades. The Cascades are this mountain range. The Cascades are this mountain range that runs south-north through Oregon and Washington. It's a much moister climate on the ocean side and a much drier climate away from the ocean. So Douglas fir west of the Cascades, and then ponderosa pine east of the Cascades. If you've traveled out in the west, you've probably seen those species. They don't grow in the Appalachians. For this week, I'm going to ask you to do something that I hope you'll find fun, which is to watch a Disney video about Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan was a legendary mythical lumberjack who cut down lots and lots of trees with the help of his trusty blue ox named Babe, not Dave. So Daniel Boone, we know for sure, was a real person. Paul Bunyan, it's not for sure whether he really was a person or if he's just a myth. Nobody knows that for sure. As you watch this little Disney movie, I'd like you to try to sort out the fact from the fiction. Which parts of the film are grounded in the historical facts that we've just looked at in this lecture? Which aspects of the Disney film are clearly exaggerated? And finally, what do the parts of the film that are exaggerated and purely fictional tell us about people's attitudes towards the logging industry and this time period in American history when so many trees got cut down so fast? As you'll see when you watch the Disney film, in the legend of Paul Bunyan is this super, muscular, macho sort of lumberjack who can cut down 1 million trees in a day and never get tired and never get sick. The truth of the matter is that logging was at that time, and really still is, a very exhausting and risky occupation. So here's a quotation describing what life might have been like for real-life lumberjacks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Picture a bent and to me rather pathetic figure plodding along a woods trail in the astonishing Northwest forest. Perhaps he drags along a frayed old imitation leather suitcase. More likely, everything in the world he can call his own is wrapped in a filthy blanket roll that hangs upon his back. His eyes are dull and reddened, his joints are stiff with rheumatism almost universal in the wettest climate in the world. His teeth are rotting, he is racked with strange diseases and tortured by unrealized dreams that haunt his soul. So, just to drive home the point, these are men who worked in extremely difficult conditions to cut down these trees. You have someone like Weyerhaeuser who, earned a ton of money by sort of unifying the industry, but then these are kind of the people on the ground who are doing the dirty work. Now, once you get to the early 20th century, you have the advent of photography, so we can actually see pictures of what these men's, working conditions looked like, how they cut down the trees. So just a couple examples of these, really kind of stunning photos. So here are some lumberjacks in front of a tree. They've cut a wedge in the tree. There's a man lying in the wedge. And you can see the hand tools next to the trees. They did cut down these enormous trees by hand, basically. Then when it was time to float the logs down the river to their destination, that was hard work too. You see here the men standing on top of the logs as the logs are in this, water that's rushing along. So, that was a careful balancing job. And if you've ever wondered where the word logjam comes from, we still use the word logjam as a metaphor for things that kind of get stuck and can't move forward. Well, here's a literal logjam, too many logs floating down the same river and men on the logs that are on the water trying to unravel or untangle the whole thing. Okay, so now let's turn from deforestation to responses to deforestation. As all of these trees got cut down across the country for the reasons I've been explaining, some Americans started to say, wait, this is too much. We're cutting down too many trees. We're destroying beautiful landscapes. We're using these resources unsustainably. What's going to happen when stuff runs out? Is this really the way that we want to live in this amazing land? So two basic responses to forest depletion are first the conservation movement and second professional forestry. And today we'll focus on the conservation movement. I'll get to forestry in a later week. The conservation movement was basically the idea of setting aside forests and natural land for enjoyment and recreation, like enjoying nature for its own sake and the inspiration that it can bring. And at the same time, in the American arts and American philosophy, you see nature and wilderness becoming a bigger and bigger theme. So as early as 1837, you get a little song like this popular song, Woodman Spare That Tree. Lots of people would have sung this song in their parlors. It's a little, song with piano accompaniment. And if this was face-to-face, I would play you the song in class. To be honest, most of my students have found the music to be a little bit boring, so you'll get spared that unless you want to go look it up, and I'll post the link for you on As You Learn. But you can see in the lyrics, the writer is pleading with someone with an axe, a woodman, not to cut down one of his favorite trees, to leave it standing. Woodman, spare that tree, touch not a single bough, and youth had sheltered me, and I'll protect it now. Okay, and in composers who are working in what we might call the European classical tradition, you also see themes of nature coming up. So Anthony Philip Heinrich is one of the first American composers really coming out of the European classical music tradition. He was born in Europe himself. Originally he was a businessman from a business family, but he learned some music when he was a kid. He came to the US in his 30s and switched from business to music. And, we talked about Daniel Boone opening up Kentucky for settlements. So Heinrich was someone who settled in a Kentucky log cabin in 1817. He gained a reputation for liking to live out in nature. And he also was good friends with John James Audubon, who we'll look at more in a minute. Audubon was the ornithologist who painted those famous bird pictures that I'm sure you've seen. So Heinrich basically just spent a lot of his life sitting out in nature and writing really large orchestral works, for example. Sometimes his music got performed, other times it didn't. Here's a CD cover of, if you still remember what a CD is, of a contemporary recording of a piece of his called the ornithological combat of kings. Here is some titles of some of his other large musical pieces that take nature as their inspiration. And this one here, The Columbiad or Migration of American Wild Passenger Pigeons, this takes us back to the passenger pigeons that we've talked about in earlier classes, the birds that were so abundant at this time that they darkened the sky as they flew over, but eventually went extinct from overhunting. And Heinrich wrote an entire orchestral suite dedicated to these birds, their lifestyle, their habits. You know, there's moments in the musical piece where the pigeons like break the branch of a tree when they land on it. So if any, music lovers want to look this up, I'll put this link up on As You Learn to a performance of this piece that has some good illustrations in the background as well. Now, if you've taken a music history class, pretty good odds that you've never heard of Heinrich because his music isn't performed too much today. I like to include him because his works have such a strong nature theme, and they kind of connect with this early conservationism and the idea of appreciating, for example, the amazing bird life in North America. So speaking of birds, let's turn to Audubon. Audubon originally came from Haiti and spent some of his early life living in France, but eventually settled in the United States. Again, he's a businessman who didn't do so well in business, but that's actually a good thing for us because he turned out to be an immensely talented painter and produced what are still really some of the most famous paintings in American art history, especially, of course, birds. So even if you don't know the name Audubon, you've almost certainly seen his paintings. They're on mouse pads, they're on tote bags. Every now and then I walk through the student union and there's some random poster with an Audubon picture on it up for some reason. So here's his painting of a passenger pigeon. Again, that famous bird, that's what they looked like. Here's his painting of a Carolina wren. These birds are not extinct. They're in my backyard. They have a beautiful song. I love the Carolina wren. And a Florida cormorant, just to take us a little bit further south for those of you who are from Florida, who like Florida, who have been to Florida. So now let's turn from music and art to philosophy and start with Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the most famous American philosophers who lived from 1803 to 1882. He was based in Concord, Massachusetts, and was the leader of what we call the Transcendentalist movement. They were involved with social causes like abolitionism, the establishment of utopian communities, vegetarianism. It was sort of a cross between a spiritual and an intellectual sort of a movement. Some of the expressions that they coined, like for example civil disobedience, are still expressions that we hear in political movements today. One of Emerson's most famous writings was a book called Nature, and you'll read excerpts of Nature for your assignment 7. In Nature, Emerson talks a lot about how he feels when he's out in nature. Being out in nature is kind of a spiritual experience, how nature helps him to escape from some of the more oppressive and stifling aspects of his own everyday life in what he's considering modern society. One of his most famous quotations, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith." Emerson was the mentor to Henry David Thoreau, who was a little bit younger than him. Thoreau was born in Concord, Massachusetts, had an early connection to trees in that his father made pencils. Concord had undergone a lot of deforestation by the time that Thoreau was a mature man. It had originally been over 90% forested, but by 1850 had only 10% of its original forest cover. So Thoreau had seen that deforestation in his own life and with his own eyes. Just as a strange side fact, Thoreau once set several hundred acres of wood on fire by accident, so we all make mistakes, and that was one of his, but he did go on to become one of the great inspirations for the modern conservation movement. Again, Emerson mentored Thoreau both through the example of Emerson's own writings and concretely by helping Thoreau to find direction when Thoreau was kind of an aimless young man. And when Thoreau finally built his famous house at Walden Pond, that was actually on Emerson's land, so Emerson helped Thoreau very concretely. One of the most famous quotations from Thoreau is "Simplify, simplify," and incidentally, This quotation is on a little plaque on the sidewalk on the main quads of App State. So as you're walking across the quads, just occasionally look down and maybe eventually you'll notice this quotation as you walk over it. So Thoreau's desire for a simpler life is seen in his decision to live in a small house that he built himself at Walden Pond, and he stayed there for 2 years and wrote his famous book Walden based on this experience. It is important to realize that where he built this house, he was not way out deep in a very wild forest. He was actually quite close to the local town. He could hear the trains go by. His mother would sometimes bring him lunch. He once got imprisoned for tax evasion. So he was actually pretty close to civilization, but there was a little bit of a woods there, and that gave him something of a sense of escaping to nature. And when he finally published his book Walden in 1854, he wrote it as if he had been there for only 1 year, although he actually had lived there for 2. So I'm going to leave you with an image of a reconstruction of his little house, which if you're into tiny houses these days, or like the tiny house movement, he's actually an inspiration to people who build their own tiny houses today. That's pretty much exactly what he did. And this is a famous quotation about why he went out into the woods. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. So for your assignment 7, you're going to read some further excerpts from writings of both Thoreau and Emerson. And I'm going to ask you to respond personally to quotations that strike you. Hopefully you'll find quotations that you like, that you find inspiring, although if you dislike them, that's fine too. Kind of relate this to your own life. Do they evoke things about nature that remind you of how nature makes you feel? Does Thoreau's comments about his time at Walden inspire you to want to live a certain way? Do you see connections between Emerson and Thoreau and the contemporary conservation movement that you may consider yourself to be a part of? Just really whatever you want to write, however you want to respond to them. Okay, so I look forward to reading your responses to Emerson and Thoreau. And here are the references in case you want to look up anything further from this lecture. Okay, so talk to you again soon, and bye-bye.